My mother slept with my fiancé and came back crawling with a ridiculous request. My mother pulled me aside during the rehearsal dinner and said, "I slept with Robbie last week." Robbie was my fiancé of 4 years. I thought she was making some sick joke until I saw the guilt in her eyes. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to. She actually reached for my hand like we were going to bond over this. I found Robbie outside smoking with his groomsmen. He didn't even deny it. Just shrugged and said my mom had come on to him and he was weak. Like sleeping with your future mother-in-law was equivalent to eating an extra slice of cake. I called off the wedding that night, sent a mass text to all guests that it was canceled, moved out of our apartment the next day, blocked them both on everything. Within 6 months, I was regional manager making twice what Robbie made. I bought a townhouse and adopted 2 rescue cats, started therapy and joined a hiking group where I met actual friends. My therapist helped me realize my mother had been competing with me my whole life, wearing inappropriate outfits to my graduations, flirting with my high school boyfriends. This was just her biggest betrayal yet. 8 months after the canceled wedding, my mother showed up at my office. Not to apologize. She was crying and asking for help. "I need you to talk to Robbie for me. He won't return my calls." The audacity made me laugh out loud. But she wasn't done. She explained they'd been seeing each other since the wedding was canceled, that they were in love. That age was just a number. "I need you to be my maid of honor." She said it completely straight-faced. "You're marrying my ex-fiancé? We're soulmates. And you still have all those vendor contacts. The venue might give us the same date since you canceled so last minute." She wanted my wedding venue, my vendors, my plans. She'd already told family I was supportive, posted on Facebook about how mature I was being, even used my engagement photo locations, just cropping me out and inserting herself. She pulled out her phone to show me. "Look, I'm wearing your grandmother's ring. Robbie said you'd want me to have it." The ring my dying grandmother had given me specifically, now on my mother's finger. I stayed calm, told her I needed time to process. For 2 weeks, she bombarded me with messages about dress shopping and cake tasting. She sent links to mother of the bride dresses asking if they were too young for her. I met with my friend who was a party planner. We spent hours crafting the perfect response. I reached out to family members and learned she'd been lying extensively. Told them I'd begged her to take Robbie off my hands. My aunt revealed that mom had been pursuing Robbie throughout our entire relationship, showing up at his gym, texting him constantly. The seduction had been years in the making. We met at a restaurant where she immediately started talking about centerpieces. I let her ramble for 5 minutes. Then I slid my phone across the table showing a Facebook post I'd just published. It detailed exactly what happened. How she'd slept with my fiancé. How she was trying to use my wedding plans. How she'd lied to everyone. "Take that down immediately." She grabbed for my phone. "How could you do this to me?" "The same way you did it to me. Publicly and without remorse." She started crying about her reputation. How Robbie would leave her if there was drama. I stood up to leave. She grabbed my wrist. "Wait, there's something else. I'm pregnant. Robbie doesn't know yet. Please." I looked at her hand on my wrist. The same hand wearing my grandmother's ring. "That's not my problem." I walked out. The Facebook post went viral in our family. Aunts and uncles who'd believed her lies started calling to apologize. My grandmother's sister threatened to sue for the ring. Robbie's parents found out the full story and were horrified. 3 weeks later, my mother announced the pregnancy publicly, trying to salvage her image. Robbie proposed properly this time, probably out of obligation. But here's what she didn't expect. Robbie's ex-girlfriend from college reached out to me after seeing my post. She told me my mother wasn't the first older woman Robbie had been with. His pattern was targeting women who could advance his career or lifestyle. My mother had money. I had potential. We were both marks. I forwarded everything to my mother anonymously. She didn't believe it at first. Then she started watching, noticing how Robbie's eyes wandered, how he'd disappear for hours, how he seemed more interested in her credit cards than her company. She called me 6 months pregnant, crying. "You were right. He's been cheating. With someone from his office. She's 23. I listened. I didn't comfort her. "I don't know what to do. I'm alone and pregnant and everyone hates me. You made your choices. Now you live with them." I hung up. My mother had the baby. A girl. Robbie signed away his rights and moved to another state with the 23-year-old. Sometimes I see photos of my half-sister on social media. She looks like me when I was little. Same eyes, same smile. I don't reach out. Maybe one day when she's older and can understand, I'll tell her the truth. But that's not my responsibility right now. I'm engaged again. To a man I met in my hiking group. Someone who's never met my mother and never will. At our wedding, the maid of honor will be my best friend Claire. The mother of the bride seat will be empty. And I'll finally have the day I deserved all along. Female text. My mother pulled me aside during the rehearsal dinner and said, I slept with Robbie last week. Robbie was my fiancé of 4 years. I thought she was making some sick joke until I saw the guilt in her eyes. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to. She actually reached for my hand like we were going to bond over this. I found Robbie outside smoking with his groomsmen. He didn't even deny it. Just shrugged and said my mom had come on to him and he was weak. Like sleeping with your future mother-in-law was equivalent to eating an extra slice of cake. I called off the wedding that night, sent a mass text to all guests that it was canceled, moved out of our apartment the next day, blocked them both on everything. Within 6 months, I was regional manager making twice what Robbie made. I bought a townhouse and adopted 2 rescue cats. Started therapy and joined a hiking group where I met actual friends. My therapist helped me realize my mother had been competing with me my whole life, wearing inappropriate outfits to my graduations, flirting with my high school boyfriends. This was just her biggest betrayal yet. 8 months after the canceled wedding, my mother showed up at my office. Not to apologize. She was crying and asking for help. I need you to talk to Robbie for me. He won't return my calls. The audacity made me laugh out loud, but she wasn't done. She explained they'd been seeing each other since the wedding was canceled, that they were in love. That age was just a number. I need you to be my maid of honor. She said it completely straight-faced. You're marrying my ex-fiancé? We're soulmates. And you still have all those vendor contacts. The venue might give us the same date since you canceled so last minute. She wanted my wedding venue, my vendors, my plans. She'd already told family I was supportive, posted on Facebook about how mature I was being, even used my engagement photo locations, just cropping me out and inserting herself. She pulled out her phone to show me. Look, I'm wearing your grandmother's ring. Robbie said you'd want me to have it. The ring my dying grandmother had given me specifically. Now on my mother's finger. I stayed calm. Told her I needed time to process. For 2 weeks, she bombarded me with messages about dress shopping and cake tasting. She sent links to mother of the bride dresses asking if they were too young for her. I met with my friend who was a party planner. We spent hours crafting the perfect response. I reached out to family members and learned she'd been lying extensively. Told them I'd begged her to take Robbie off my hands. My aunt revealed that mom had been pursuing Robbie throughout our entire relationship, showing up at his gym, texting him constantly. The seduction had been years in the making. We met at a restaurant where she immediately started talking about centerpieces. I let her ramble for 5 minutes. Then I slid my phone across the table showing a Facebook post I'd just published. It detailed exactly what happened. How she'd slept with my fiancé. How she was trying to use my wedding plans. How she'd lied to everyone. Take that down immediately. She grabbed for my phone. How could you do this to me? The same way you did it to me. Publicly and without remorse. She started crying about her reputation. How Robbie would leave her if there was drama. I stood up to leave. She grabbed my wrist. Wait, there's something else. I'm pregnant. Robbie doesn't know yet. Please. I looked at her hand on my wrist. The same hand wearing my grandmother's ring. That's not my problem. I walked out. The Facebook post went viral in our family. Aunts and uncles who'd believed her lies started calling to apologize. My grandmother's sister threatened to sue for the ring. Robbie's parents found out the full story and were horrified. 3 weeks later, my mother announced the pregnancy publicly, trying to salvage her image. Robbie proposed properly this time, probably out of obligation. But here's what she didn't expect. Robbie's ex-girlfriend from college reached out to me after seeing my post. She told me my mother wasn't the first older woman Robbie had been with. His pattern was targeting women who could advance his career or lifestyle. My mother had money. I had potential. We were both marks. I forwarded everything to my mother anonymously. She didn't believe it at first. Then she started watching, noticing how Robbie's eyes wandered, how he'd disappear for hours, how he seemed more interested in her credit cards than her company. She called me 6 months pregnant, crying. You were right. He's been cheating. With someone from his office. She's 23. I listened. I didn't comfort her. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and pregnant and everyone hates me. You made your choices. Now you live with them. I hung up. My mother had the baby. A girl. Robbie signed away his rights and moved to another state with the 23-year-old. Sometimes I see photos of my half-sister on social media. She looks like me when I was little. Same eyes, same smile. I don't reach out. Maybe one day when she's older and can understand, I'll tell her the truth. But that's not my responsibility right now. I'm engaged again. To a man I met in my hiking group. Someone who's never met my mother and never will. At our wedding, the maid of honor will be my best friend Claire. The mother of the bride seat will be empty. And I'll finally have the day I deserved all along. 3 months before my wedding, I sat across from Rachel in her office with fabric samples spread between us. She had this huge binder open to the seating chart page, and we were figuring out the final guest count. Rachel kept pointing at different sections of the venue layout, explaining traffic flow for the cocktail hour. Then she paused and looked up at me with this careful expression that made my stomach tighten. She mentioned the venue got a call yesterday from someone claiming to be my mother. The woman asked about arrangements for her daughter's wedding and wanted to know if she could add herself to the vendor contact list. Rachel said the venue staff thought it was strange since my paperwork clearly stated no mother of the bride. My hands went cold holding the fabric samples. I felt that familiar drop in my chest, the same feeling I got when I first found out about the betrayal. My mother was still trying to worm her way into my life after everything she'd done. I grabbed my phone immediately and started making calls right there in Rachel's office. First the venue, then the caterer, then the photographer, then the florist. I gave each vendor the same instructions. Add my mother's name to a do not engage list. I described what she looked like and said I'd email them a photo. If she showed up or called again, they were to refuse all information and contact me immediately. Rachel watched me make the calls and nodded approvingly when I finished. She told me this wasn't her first rodeo with difficult family situations. She'd dealt with everything from feuding divorced parents to stalker exes trying to crash weddings. Rachel assured me she'd personally brief the venue security team and make sure they had my mother's photo. She suggested we also hire private security for the actual wedding day, just as an extra layer of protection. I agreed immediately, even though it made me sad that it was necessary. My fiancé got home from work around 6 that evening and found me sitting on the couch staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and asked what was wrong. I told him about my mother calling the venue and trying to get information about the wedding. His jaw tightened and he pulled me against his chest. I started crying these angry tears that surprised me because I thought I was past this. I thought I'd moved on and built my new life and my mother couldn't hurt me anymore. But here she was again, trying to push her way into the one day that was supposed to be completely mine. My fiancé held me and let me cry without saying anything for a few minutes. Then he suggested we hire security for the wedding day. I told him Rachel already recommended the same thing and I'd agreed to it. He kissed the top of my head and said we'd do whatever it took to protect our day. The fact that I needed security to keep my own mother away from my wedding felt both sad and completely necessary, given her history of stomping all over my boundaries. I had my regular therapy appointment with Cole the following week. I walked into his office and dropped onto the couch and told him about my mother's latest stunt. Cole listened without interrupting while I explained how she'd called the venue pretending she had any right to be involved in my wedding plans. He reminded me that my mother's behavior reflected her own issues, not my worth as a person. We spent the session talking about strategies for maintaining my peace while protecting my special day. Cole suggested I visualize the wedding going perfectly without any disruption from my mother. He had me practice some grounding techniques I could use if I started feeling anxious as the date got closer. We discussed how hiring security was a smart boundary rather than an overreaction. Cole pointed out that I'd done everything right by alerting all the vendors and taking concrete steps to protect myself. He said my mother's inability to respect boundaries said everything about her character, and nothing about mine. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find a certified letter waiting in my mailbox. My hands shook as I signed for it and carried it inside. I didn't recognize the law firm name on the return address. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal letter from an attorney I'd never heard of requesting a meeting to discuss the child's future and family relationships. I read it 3 times trying to make sense of the legal language. The letter talked about establishing communication protocols and discussing arrangements that would benefit all parties involved. It carefully avoided saying anything specific, but the implication was clear. My mother wanted to talk about my relationship with my half-sister. She was using a lawyer to pressure me into some kind of meeting after I'd made my boundaries crystal clear. I was furious that she thought hiring an attorney would somehow force me to engage with her. The letter implied she wanted to establish some kind of relationship between me and the baby. I'd been clear that I wanted nothing to do with my mother, and any potential future connection with my half-sister would happen on my terms and timeline. Not hers. Never hers. The fact that she was using legal pressure made me even more angry because it showed she still didn't understand or respect the damage she'd caused. I put the letter down on the table and just stared at it for a while. My cats came over and rubbed against my legs like they could sense I was upset. I picked up my phone and took photos of every page of the letter. I forwarded the photos to my own attorney the next morning with a message explaining the situation. She called me back within an hour. My attorney said I had absolutely no legal obligation to respond to the letter or attend any meeting. The request was just that. A request, and I could ignore it completely if I wanted. However, she suggested I might want to hear what was proposed, if only to protect myself from any future claims my mother might try to make. My attorney explained that sometimes it was better to know what the other side wanted, rather than being blindsided later. She offered to attend any meeting on my behalf so I wouldn't have to be in the same room as my mother. I told her I'd think about it and get back to her. I spent the next few days going back and forth about whether to engage at all. Part of me wanted to ignore the whole thing completely. My mother had proven over and over that she couldn't be trusted and would twist anything I said or did to serve her own purposes. But another part of me was curious what she thought she could possibly say that would make any difference. Against my initial instincts, I finally told my attorney I'd agree to a phone meeting. I would not be in the same room as my mother under any circumstances. My attorney could attend the meeting in person with my mother's lawyer, and I'd participate by phone only. That way, I could hang up immediately if things went sideways. My attorney said that was a smart compromise and scheduled the meeting for the following week. The day of the meeting arrived, and I sat in my car in a parking lot with my phone on speaker. My attorney was in a conference room across town with my mother's lawyer. I could hear papers shuffling and chairs scraping as everyone got settled. My mother's lawyer started talking in this careful, professional voice. He explained that my mother was struggling financially and emotionally as a single parent. The baby was healthy, but my mother was overwhelmed trying to manage everything alone. I didn't say anything, just listened. Then I heard crying in the background. Quiet at first, then louder. My mother was crying and it felt so manipulative I almost hung up right then. The lawyer kept talking like he couldn't hear her sobbing. He said my mother was doing her best in a difficult situation and hoped we could find a path forward that would benefit everyone involved. The lawyer carefully suggested that my mother hoped I might be willing to have some form of relationship with my half-sister as she grew up. He emphasized there was no ask for money or direct help, just a hope that family connections could be maintained for the child's sake. The implication hung heavy even through the phone line. My mother wanted me to step in and help raise the baby she'd created by sleeping with my fiancé. She wanted me to forgive her betrayal and play happy family like nothing had happened. I listened to her crying in the background and felt absolutely nothing except anger at the continued manipulation. My attorney's voice came through the phone speaker with that professional calm she always used. She spoke directly to my mother's lawyer and laid out my position in clear terms. I had no interest in any relationship with my mother. Any potential future connection with my half-sister would happen on my terms and my timeline, not my mother's. The lawyer on the other end said he understood and would relay that to his client. He didn't sound surprised at all, like he'd expected exactly this response. I heard more crying in the background, but my attorney was already wrapping up the call, confirming they'd send official documentation of my position. When the call ended, I sat in my car in the parking lot staring at my phone. My hands were shaking, and I felt this weird tightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. I thought I'd moved past all this. I thought the therapy and the new life and the new relationship had buried these feelings deep enough that they couldn't reach me anymore. But hearing my mother's tears through that phone line brought everything rushing back. The betrayal, the manipulation, the way she'd looked at me when she first told me about sleeping with Robbie, like we were going to be friends about it. I started the car and drove home on autopilot, barely paying attention to the road. My fiancé got home from work around 6 that evening and found me sitting on the couch with my phone in my hands. I'd been scrolling through old photos without really meaning to. Pictures from before everything fell apart. Me and Robbie at the beach. Me and my mother at my college graduation. Her wearing that dress that was way too young for her age. Me at my old apartment, smiling at the camera like I had no idea what was coming. He sat down next to me without saying anything. Didn't ask what was wrong or try to tell me it would be okay. Just put his arm around my shoulders and pulled me against his chest. I started crying these quiet tears that surprised me because I thought I was done crying over my mother. I thought I'd used up all my tears on her years ago. But here I was again, letting her get to me. He held me and stroked my hair and didn't say a single word for probably 20 minutes. Just let me cry it out while I clutched my phone with those old photos still glowing on the screen. Eventually, I wiped my face and told him about the call. About my mother crying in the background like she was the victim. About how hearing her tears made me feel guilty, even though I knew I had nothing to feel guilty about. He kissed the top of my head and said I was allowed to feel complicated things about the situation. That it didn't make me weak or mean I was backsliding. It just meant I was human. Claire showed up at my door the next evening with 2 bottles of wine and enough Thai takeout for 4 people. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug before even coming inside. We sat on my couch with containers of pad thai and spring rolls spread across the coffee table. One of my cats immediately tried to steal a piece of chicken, and Claire gently pushed him away. I told her about the lawyer meeting and my mother's request, and how I'd been looking at old photos. She listened while eating her noodles and didn't interrupt once. When I finally got to the part about feeling guilty, she put down her fork and looked at me hard. She said I needed to hear something important. My half-sister growing up with my mother as her only parent wasn't my fault or my responsibility. My mother made her choices, and those choices had consequences. I wasn't obligated to fix the mess she created by sleeping with my fiancé and destroying our family. Claire reminded me that other relatives had set up that fund to help with baby expenses, that my half-sister wouldn't be completely alone in the world. But more importantly, she said, I couldn't set myself on fire to keep someone else warm. Especially not when that someone was the innocent result of my mother's betrayal. I ate another spring roll and let her words sink in. She was right. I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. I had my regular therapy appointment with Cole the following week, and I walked into his office and dropped onto the familiar couch and told him everything. The lawyer meeting, the photos, the guilt. He listened with that patient expression he always had, the one that made you feel like he had all the time in the world just for you. When I finished talking, he asked me what I was really feeling about my half-sister versus what I was feeling about my mother. I had to think about that for a minute. The feelings were all tangled up together like headphone cords in a pocket. Cole helped me separate them out. My anger at my mother was justified and probably permanent. She'd betrayed me in the worst possible way, and then tried to steal my wedding plans and lie to my family about it. That anger wasn't going anywhere, and it shouldn't. But my half-sister was innocent. She didn't ask to be born into this situation. She didn't choose to have a mother who destroyed her own daughter's life. Cole said I might choose to have a relationship with her one day. Or I might not. Both options were okay. The important thing was that the decision was mine to make on my timeline. Not my mother's, not my family's, mine. He said I didn't have to decide anything right now. I could leave that door open or closed or somewhere in between. Whatever felt right for protecting my peace. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in days. I was at work the next week reviewing quarterly reports when my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed a law firm name I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer because I was tired of lawyers, but curiosity won out. A woman's voice introduced herself as the attorney for my grandmother's sister. My stomach dropped. She explained that my mother still hadn't returned the family ring despite multiple letters requesting its return. They'd given her plenty of time to do the right thing, but she'd ignored every attempt at contact. Now they were prepared to file theft charges if she didn't surrender the ring within 30 days. The attorney's voice was professional, but I could hear the frustration underneath. She asked if I'd be willing to serve as an intermediary since I was family, and might have better luck getting through to my mother. I actually laughed out loud at that suggestion. I told her I was probably the last person on earth my mother would listen to. We hadn't spoken directly in over a year, and our last conversation had ended with me telling her to live with the consequences of her choices. The attorney sighed like she'd expected that answer but had to ask anyway. I gave her my mother's current address from the legal letter I'd received about the meeting. Told her to do whatever she needed to do about the ring. It belonged to my family and my mother had stolen it. If she faced criminal charges for that, it was her own fault. 2 days later, my phone rang with my mother's number. I stared at the screen for a long moment. We hadn't spoken directly since that call when she was 6 months pregnant and crying about Robbie cheating on her. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but a bigger part of me was curious what she could possibly want now. I answered and immediately put her on speaker so my fiancé could hear everything. He was sitting across from me at the kitchen table and he nodded when I made eye contact. My mother's voice came through the speaker and she sounded small. Defeated. Not like the confident woman who'd tried to steal my wedding or the manipulative one who'd cried during the lawyer meeting. She begged me to call off my grandmother's sister. Said the threat of criminal charges was too much. She was already struggling as a single parent and she couldn't handle this on top of everything else. The ring was the only valuable thing she had left. She couldn't bear to give it up. I felt my jaw clench as I listened to her make excuses. My fiancé reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I told her in the coldest voice I could manage that she'd stolen a family heirloom. That ring had been given to me specifically by my dying grandmother. She had no right to keep it. My mother started crying and saying she'd thought of it as a loan. Like I'd just let her borrow my grandmother's ring to wear while she married my ex-fiancé. The lie was so obvious I almost hung up right then. My fiancé squeezed my hand harder and I took a breath. I told her she needed to return the ring to grandmother's sister immediately. That if she faced criminal charges, it was because of her own choices, not because of anything I did. She kept crying and saying she needed the ring, that it was all she had. I could hear the baby making noise in the background and my chest got tight again. But I didn't let that change what I needed to say. I told her the ring wasn't hers to sell. She made the choice to sleep with Robbie and destroy our family. The baby wasn't my problem to fix. My mother's voice changed completely. The crying stopped and anger took over. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She said I was cruel and unforgiving, that I'd turned the whole family against her when she just made one mistake. I could feel my blood pressure rising as I gripped the phone tighter. She kept talking about how everyone hated her now because of me, how I'd ruined her reputation over one little error in judgment. I cut her off mid-sentence. Sleeping with my fiancé wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A series of choices, actually. Showing up at his gym, texting him constantly, seducing him while I was planning our wedding, then trying to steal my wedding plans and lie to everyone about it. That wasn't a mistake. That was calculated cruelty. She started to argue, but I talked over her. I told her I was done with this conversation. She could return the ring or face criminal charges. Those were her only options. Before I could hang up, her voice got desperate again. She said my half-sister deserved to know her big sister, that I was being selfish by keeping myself away from an innocent baby. I took a breath and said something I'd been thinking for months. My half-sister deserved better than growing up watching her mother manipulate and betray people. She deserved better than learning those patterns. I ended the call. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. My whole body felt like I'd just run a race. Adrenaline made my chest tight and my breathing fast. My fiancé must have heard my voice getting louder because he came into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around me and I started crying these angry tears that surprised me. Not sad tears. Just pure rage at my mother's continued refusal to take any real responsibility. He held me against his chest while I cried and told me he was proud. Proud that I'd stood my ground. Proud that I didn't let her manipulate me into feeling responsible for her situation. He stroked my hair and said I'd done everything right. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing constantly. 17 missed calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins. I sat up in bed and started scrolling through my notifications. My mother had posted on Facebook again, this time claiming I was trying to have her arrested, that I was keeping her baby from having any family support, that I was cruel and vindictive and had always been jealous of her. I showed my fiancé the post, and he shook his head. He asked if I wanted him to respond, but I said no. I was exhausted by her continued attempts to paint herself as the victim. But I also knew I couldn't let this lie stand without correction. I made coffee and sat at my laptop, drafted a simple Facebook post stating facts without emotion. I explained that my grandmother had given me a specific family ring before she died, that my mother had taken the ring without permission, that my grandmother's sister had legal right to demand its return. I wrote about my clear boundaries regarding not having a relationship with my mother, how those boundaries existed because of her choices and actions, not because of anything I'd done. I kept it short and factual, posted it, and then turned off my phone for a few hours. When I turned it back on that afternoon, the family response was overwhelming. Aunts and uncles were commenting that my mother needed to return the ring immediately, that she needed to stop trying to manipulate me and take responsibility for her actions. Several relatives I barely knew offered to help with baby expenses if she returned the heirloom. That surprised me. I hadn't expected anyone to offer financial help. My cousin messaged me privately saying she'd always known my mother was competitive with me, but hadn't realized how bad it was. 3 days later, I got a call from grandmother's sister's attorney. My mother had returned the ring, just dropped it off at the law office that morning without saying a word. The attorney said I could pick it up whenever I wanted, or they could mail it to grandmother's sister. I felt this weight lift off my chest that I didn't realize I'd been carrying. That ring had been such a symbol of everything my mother had stolen from me. Knowing it was back where it belonged made me feel lighter somehow. I told the attorney to give it to grandmother's sister. It belonged with her now. My aunt called me that same evening. She said she and several other relatives had set up a small fund to help with my half-sister's basic needs: diapers, formula, clothes, the essentials. She was careful to say this didn't excuse my mother's behavior at all, that everyone understood why I'd cut contact, but they didn't want the baby to suffer because of adult mistakes. I thanked her and said I appreciated them thinking of my half-sister. It was weird feeling relieved that other people were stepping in to help. Part of me had worried that cutting off my mother meant my half-sister would have nothing. But my family was handling it in a way that didn't require me to sacrifice my peace. My aunt said if I ever wanted to meet my half-sister, the family would support that. But there was no pressure or expectation, just an open door if I ever chose to walk through it. I felt something shift inside me when my aunt finished talking. Not forgiveness toward my mother, but something softer toward the baby who didn't choose any of this. My aunt must have sensed it because she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I thanked her for organizing the family fund and told her I appreciated everyone stepping up for the baby's sake. She said the family understood my boundaries completely, and nobody expected me to change them. If I ever wanted to meet my half-sister someday, they'd support it. But if I never did, they'd support that too. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks, knowing my half-sister wouldn't grow up completely alone even without me in her life. Rachel called me the next morning to schedule our final planning session before the wedding. I met her at her office downtown where she had everything spread across her massive conference table. Seating charts, timeline breakdowns, vendor contact sheets, and photos of the venue setup. She walked me through every detail of the day, from the morning hair appointments to the final sparkler send-off at night. I found myself getting genuinely excited instead of anxious like I'd been during the Robbie wedding planning. Rachel had listened to everything I wanted and created exactly the elegant celebration I'd dreamed of. Deep burgundy linens, cream roses, string lights wrapped around the outdoor ceremony space. Everything felt authentically mine without my mother's shadow trying to reshape it into something else. Rachel noticed my smile and said she could tell I was ready for this. I told her I finally felt like I was having the wedding I actually wanted, not the one someone else tried to force on me. Fatima met us at the venue the following week to show me the final flower designs. She had mock-ups set up in the reception hall, full-scale arrangements that took my breath away when I walked in. Sophisticated clusters of burgundy dahlias, cream garden roses, and touches of eucalyptus that looked nothing like the pastel pink disaster my mother had tried to push on me years ago. These flowers reflected my actual taste, my actual personality, not some fantasy version my mother wanted me to be. Fatima walked me through each arrangement, explaining her choices for the ceremony arch, the reception centerpieces, the bouquets. I touched the soft petals of a cream rose and felt tears prick my eyes. My fiancé squeezed my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I told him these were happy tears because everything was finally, truly mine. This wedding would be authentically mine in every single detail. 2 months before the wedding, Claire and I went dress shopping at a boutique downtown. She'd taken the whole afternoon off work to help me find the perfect gown. We were in the third shop looking through racks of white and ivory dresses when I saw a woman with a baby across the store near the fitting rooms. My whole body went rigid. The woman had dark hair like my mother, and she was wearing sunglasses inside, which seemed suspicious. My heart started racing, and I felt that familiar panic rising in my chest, the same feeling I got when my mother showed up at my office demanding I help her with Robbie. I stared at the woman, trying to see her face clearly, trying to figure out if I needed to leave immediately. The woman turned slightly, and I saw her profile. Different nose, different chin. Younger than my mother by at least 10 years. Just a stranger shopping with her baby. Not my mother at all. Claire touched my arm gently and asked if I was okay. I realized I'd been standing frozen in place, staring at a complete stranger like a crazy person. I admitted I'd thought the woman might be my mother for a second, and I'd panicked. Claire squeezed my hand and reminded me we had security arranged for the wedding day. My mother had no power over my joy anymore. She couldn't show up and ruin things because we'd taken every precaution possible. I took a deep breath and nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. Claire suggested we look at dresses in a different section, away from the woman who'd triggered my panic. I followed her to the back of the store where the modern gowns were displayed. I found my dress 20 minutes later. A sleek, modern gown with clean lines and a dramatic train that made me feel beautiful and strong instead of like a princess in a fairy tale. I stood in front of the three-way mirror in the fitting room while Claire fastened the tiny buttons up my back. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same person who'd almost married Robbie 4 years ago. That woman had been younger, less sure of herself, willing to overlook red flags because she wanted the fairy tale. This woman knew her worth. This woman had rebuilt her entire life from nothing and come out stronger. I turned to Claire with tears in my eyes and told her this was the one. She started crying too and said I looked absolutely perfect. The saleswoman brought champagne and we toasted to new beginnings while I stood in my wedding dress, finally ready to marry someone who actually deserved me. My fiancé and I had our final pre-marriage counseling session the following week. We'd been seeing the counselor monthly since we got engaged, working through potential issues before they became actual problems. This session focused on handling difficult family situations as a team. The counselor asked how we planned to deal with my mother if she tried to contact us after the wedding. My fiancé answered before I could, saying my boundaries with my mother were completely supported, and he'd never pressure me to reconcile. The counselor nodded approvingly and said that kind of unconditional support was exactly what healthy marriages needed. She asked if I felt confident he'd protect our family unit from outside interference. I looked at my fiancé and said yes without hesitation. He'd proven through his actions over the past year that he respected my choices and defended my boundaries. The counselor smiled and said we were ready for marriage. Cole and I had a session the next day focused specifically on preparing emotionally for the wedding. I sat in his familiar office with my usual cup of tea and admitted I was worried about the empty mother of the bride seat. Everyone would notice it. Everyone would know my mother wasn't there. Cole asked what the empty seat represented to me. I thought about it for a minute before answering. It represented my strength in choosing peace over toxic obligation. It showed I valued my mental health more than social expectations. It proved I could stand up for myself even when it was uncomfortable. Cole smiled and said I'd answered my own question. The empty seat wasn't a symbol of loss or failure. It was a symbol of growth and self-respect. He suggested I practice visualizing the ceremony with the empty seat, imagining myself feeling proud instead of ashamed. We spent the rest of the session working on grounding techniques I could use if I felt anxious on the wedding day. 1 month before the wedding, I came home from work to find a letter in my mailbox with no return address. My hands shook slightly as I carried it inside and set it on my kitchen counter. One of my cats jumped up and sniffed at the envelope like he could sense my tension. I opened it carefully and pulled out a single photo and a note card. The photo showed a baby girl, maybe 6 months old, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes. She was smiling at the camera, one tiny hand reaching toward whoever was taking the picture. The note was in my mother's handwriting, just 3 sentences. She has your eyes. Her name is Lily. I thought you should know. I stared at the photo, my chest getting tight. The baby did have my eyes. The same shape, the same color. I saw my own baby pictures in this child's face. the resemblance so strong it made my stomach hurt. My fiancé got home an hour later and found me sitting at the kitchen table with the photo in front of me. I'd been staring at it for who knows how long, not moving, barely breathing. He sat down next to me without saying anything and looked at the photo. Then he looked at my face and asked if I wanted to throw it away. I opened my mouth to say yes, but the word wouldn't come out. I admitted I wasn't sure what I wanted. Part of me wanted to rip the photo into tiny pieces and throw it in the trash. But another part of me wanted to keep it, to know what my half-sister looked like, to have some connection to this innocent baby who shared my blood. My fiancé pulled me against his chest and held me while I cried. He didn't try to tell me what to do or how to feel. He just held me and let me process the complicated mess of emotions churning in my gut. I slid the photo into my therapy session folder the next morning and drove to Cole's office. The waiting room felt smaller than usual, like the walls were pressing in while I clutched that folder against my chest. Cole opened his door right on time and gestured me inside. I sat on the familiar couch and pulled out the photo without saying anything. He took it from my hands and studied the baby's face for a long moment. Then he looked at me and asked what I was feeling beyond the obvious anger at my mother's continued boundary violations. I opened my mouth to give him the easy answer about being furious, but different words came out instead. I admitted that I felt sad for this little girl who would grow up knowing her sister chose not to be in her life. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my throat get tight. Cole set the photo on the table between us and leaned forward slightly. He said something that made me stop breathing for a second. He pointed out gently that I wasn't choosing to abandon my half-sister. I was protecting myself from my mother's toxicity, and those were different things. He suggested I might consider what kind of relationship, if any, I'd want with my half-sister when she was older and could understand the context. I picked up the photo again and looked at those eyes that mirrored mine. The baby smiled at whoever had taken the picture, completely innocent of the mess that surrounded her birth. I realized sitting there in Cole's office that my half-sister wasn't my enemy. She was another person affected by my mother's destructive choices, just like me. I told Cole I wanted to keep the photo, but I wasn't ready to display it or make any decisions about future contact. He nodded and said that was perfectly reasonable. I drove home after the session and opened the drawer in my nightstand, where I kept important documents and old letters from my grandmother. I slid the photo of the baby underneath everything else, not on display but not destroyed either. A possibility held in reserve for a future I couldn't predict. 3 weeks before the wedding, my phone rang while I was reviewing vendor contracts at my kitchen table. My aunt's name appeared on the screen and I answered expecting to discuss final guest count numbers. Instead, her voice came through tight with frustration. She told me that my mother had been calling family members trying to convince them to talk me into letting her attend the wedding. My hand clenched around my phone so hard my knuckles went white. I was furious that she was still trying to manipulate her way into my life through other people. My aunt kept talking, explaining that my mother had called her twice, called my uncle 4 times, and even reached out to distant cousins I barely knew. She was telling everyone that she'd changed, that she deserved to see her daughter get married, that keeping her away was cruel and unforgiving. I thanked my aunt for telling me and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and started typing an email to every family member on my wedding guest list. I wrote clearly and directly that my mother was not invited to my wedding, that security had her photo and would remove her if she showed up, that anyone who brought her as a +1 would be asked to leave immediately. I explained that this boundary wasn't up for discussion or negotiation. I hit send and watched the email whoosh away to 37 recipients. The responses started coming back within minutes. Aunts and uncles replied saying they understood completely and supported my decision. Several relatives apologized for my mother's continued behavior and promised they would not engage with her manipulation attempts. My cousin sent a message saying she was proud of me for standing firm. By the end of the evening, every single family member had responded with support. The final dress fitting happened on a Saturday morning 2 weeks before the wedding. Claire met me at the boutique and we were escorted to the large fitting room in the back. The seamstress brought out my dress on a padded hanger and I changed behind the curtain. When I stepped out, Claire's hand went to her mouth. The dress fit perfectly after all the alterations. Every seam hugged exactly right. The train flowed behind me like water. The seamstress adjusted the bustle and showed me how to manage the train for the reception. Then she brought in the hairstylist and makeup artist for the full trial run. They worked on me for an hour, pinning and curling and applying products until I looked like a polished version of myself. When they spun me around to face the mirror, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Claire was crying actual tears, not just getting misty. She said I deserved this happiness and this beautiful day, that I'd earned it through surviving everything my mother had put me through. I looked at my reflection and something shifted inside me. I finally let myself believe it was true. 1 week before the wedding, I woke up early and made breakfast while my fiancé was still sleeping. He came into the kitchen as I was flipping pancakes and poured himself coffee. We sat at the table eating and he asked if I'd thought any more about the baby. I put down my fork and admitted that I had been thinking about her, that I'd kept the photo my mother sent. But I told him clearly that I wasn't ready to make any decisions about potential future contact until after we were married and settled into our new life together. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said that whatever I decided, he supported me completely. Whether that meant maintaining no contact forever, or eventually building some kind of relationship with my half-sister. His unconditional support made something click in my head. This partnership was different from what I'd had with Robbie. My fiancé respected my boundaries without trying to push me toward forgiveness or reconciliation. He trusted me to know what was right for my own peace and healing. I squeezed his hand back and told him I loved him, that I was grateful every day for finding someone who actually understood what respect meant. 2 days before the wedding, I had my final therapy session with Cole. I walked into his office and sat on the couch one last time before everything changed. He asked me to reflect on how far I'd come since the original betrayal at my first wedding rehearsal dinner. I thought about that night when my mother pulled me aside and destroyed everything. About calling off the wedding and moving out and blocking everyone. About building my career and buying my townhouse and adopting my cats. About meeting my fiancé in the hiking group and learning what healthy love looked like. Cole pointed out that I'd built a life rooted in my values. That I was surrounded by people who respected my boundaries and celebrated my success. He said watching my growth over these sessions had been remarkable. I felt tears prick my eyes. But they were different tears than the ones I'd cried in his office months ago. These weren't tears of pain or betrayal. They were tears of relief and gratitude for making it through to the other side. I asked Cole the question that had been bothering me for weeks. I asked if he thought I was a bad person for not helping my half-sister more directly, for not being in her life, for letting her grow up with only my mother. Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at me with that patient expression I'd come to trust. He reminded me that I was allowed to protect my peace, that maintaining boundaries with my mother didn't make me responsible for the consequences of her choices. He said my half-sister's situation was sad, but it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my obligation to fix. That other family members had stepped up to help, and that was enough. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months, ready to walk down the aisle in 2 days and start my new life without guilt weighing me down. The rehearsal dinner was at a small Italian restaurant downtown, with white tablecloths and candles on every table. My fiancé's parents stood up with their wine glasses and made a toast about how happy they were to welcome me into their family. His mom got teary when she talked about watching us together and knowing we were meant for each other. I felt this warm feeling spread through my chest as I looked around the table at all these people who genuinely cared about me. My aunt was there with my uncle. Claire sat next to me, squeezing my hand under the table. My fiancé's sister and her husband were laughing at something his dad said. These were people who showed up for me, who believed me, who stood by my choices. I'd lost my mother, but I'd gained a real family that actually functioned like families should. The empty chair where my mother would have sat didn't bother me anymore. It just reminded me that I'd chosen peace over toxicity, and that was the right call. After dinner, Claire pulled me into the hallway near the bathrooms. She hugged me tight and told me she was so honored to be my maid of honor tomorrow. Her voice got shaky when she said watching me rebuild my entire life after what my mother did had taught her what real strength looked like. She said most people would have stayed bitter, or let the betrayal define them forever, but I'd turned it into fuel to become someone better. I started crying a little and she laughed and said we needed to save the tears for tomorrow. We went back to the table and finished dessert while everyone told embarrassing stories about me and my fiancé. His college roommate told this whole thing about how my fiancé talked about me constantly after we first met in the hiking group. How he knew right away I was different from anyone he'd dated before. My fiancé turned red and everyone laughed, but he squeezed my hand and didn't deny it. That night I got into bed and actually fell asleep within minutes. No tossing and turning. No anxiety dreams about my mother showing up and making a scene. I'd taken every possible precaution. Security had her photo. Every vendor knew not to engage with her. My family had promised to shut down any attempts she made to contact them. I'd done everything I could to protect my day, and now I just had to trust that it would work. My fiancé had proven through a year of consistent actions that he respected me and my boundaries. He'd never once pressured me to forgive my mother or suggested I was being too harsh. He'd stood beside me through every difficult decision and made it clear my peace mattered more than social expectations. Tomorrow, I'd marry someone who actually deserved me. My alarm went off at 6 and sunlight was already coming through the curtains. The weather app showed clear skies and 70 degrees. Perfect wedding weather. Claire showed up at 7 with coffee and bagels and my bridesmaids arrived right after. We took over the hotel suite with makeup bags and curling irons and the dress hanging on the closet door. The hairstylist worked on Claire first while I sat in my robe eating a bagel and watching everyone get ready. My bridesmaid kept making jokes and taking selfies. The makeup artist played music from her phone. Everything felt light and happy instead of tense like it had been during the Robbie wedding planning. Back then, my mother had been hovering constantly, criticizing my choices, trying to make everything about her. Now she wasn't here, and I felt free. The empty mother of the bride seat didn't haunt me at all. It represented freedom from someone who'd spent my whole life competing with me instead of supporting me. The photographer arrived and started taking pictures of us getting ready. Claire helped me into my dress and buttoned up the back. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Strong, happy, ready. My fiancé and I had written our own vows about partnership and respect, and building a life based on honesty. No more pretending things were fine when they weren't. No more accepting behavior that hurt me just to keep the peace. I'd learned those lessons the hard way, but at least I'd learned them before marrying the wrong person. The ceremony was in a garden behind the venue with white chairs set up in rows and an arch covered in burgundy dahlias and cream roses. I stood at the back with my uncle who'd agreed to walk me down the aisle. The music started and everyone stood up. I could see my fiancé at the front in his suit and his face lit up when he saw me. That moment made everything worth it. All the pain and betrayal and hard work rebuilding my life had led me here to someone who actually valued me. We walked down the aisle and my uncle kissed my cheek before handing me off. The officiant started talking about love and commitment, but I was just looking at my fiancé's face. He had tears in his eyes. When it came time for vows, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, and his voice shook a little as he read about how I'd taught him what real partnership looked like. How he promised to always respect my boundaries and support my choices, and be the kind of husband who made my life better, not harder. I read mine about finally understanding what healthy love felt like and promising to build a life with him based on honesty and mutual respect. The reception was in the main hall with those burgundy linens and cream roses everywhere. People kept coming up to me saying how beautiful everything was and how happy they looked to see me thriving. My aunt hugged me and whispered that my mother had tried calling her that morning, but she'd sent it straight to voicemail. She said I should know that the whole family supported my decision, and nobody blamed me for keeping my mother out of my life. I thanked her and felt grateful that I had family members who actually understood boundaries and respected them. The DJ announced our first dance, and my fiancé led me to the middle of the floor. He pulled me close and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive. I thought about how my mother's betrayal had felt like the end of the world 4 years ago, how I'd thought I'd never trust anyone again or feel happy. But that betrayal had actually led me here to someone who truly understood what love and respect meant. Claire's maid of honor speech made everyone laugh when she told stories about me adopting my cats and naming them after pasta shapes. Then she got serious and talked about watching me transform pain into power. She said I'd shown her what real strength looked like by refusing to let betrayal define me. She raised her glass and everyone toasted to resilience and new beginnings. People were wiping their eyes and my fiancé squeezed my hand under the table. The rest of the reception flew by with dancing and cake cutting, and my fiancé's dad giving a speech about how proud he was to have me as a daughter-in-law. As things started winding down around 10, I found myself thinking about Lily for the first time all day, wondering what kind of person she'd grow up to be with my mother as her only parent. Whether she'd learn the same manipulative patterns or somehow break free from them. Part of me felt sad that she'd grow up knowing her older sister chose not to be in her life. But another part of me knew I'd made the right choice for my own peace. Maybe someday when she was older and could understand the full context, I'd be open to meeting her. But that decision was mine to make on my timeline, not my mother's or anyone else's. Right now, I needed to focus on building this new life with my husband. The DJ announced last dance and everyone gathered on the floor. Then we lined up outside for the sparkler exit. Someone handed out long sparklers and lit them all at once. My husband and I walked through the tunnel of light while everyone cheered and took pictures. We got into the car that was taking us to the hotel and I looked back at everyone waving. I felt lighter than I had in years, finally free from my mother's shadow and the weight of her constant competition and betrayal. We drove away toward our honeymoon suite and our trip to Italy next week, and the whole future we were building together. A future based on respect and honesty and actual love instead of manipulation and lies. We flew to Florence 3 days after the wedding, and I spent the entire flight holding my husband's hand while he pointed out Italian phrases in the guidebook. The plane landed at sunset, and we took a taxi through winding streets to a small hotel in the countryside outside the city. Our room had windows that opened onto vineyards stretching toward distant hills. I stood at the window breathing in air that smelled like grapes and lavender while my husband unpacked our suitcases behind me. We ate dinner on the hotel terrace under string lights with other couples celebrating anniversaries and honeymoons. The waiter brought wine and pasta, and my husband toasted to our future without any shadow of the past hanging over us. I realized I hadn't thought about my mother once since we left the reception. Not during the drive to the airport or the flight or the taxi ride through Florence. She wasn't taking up space in my head anymore. We spent the next week driving through Tuscany, visiting small towns and eating at restaurants recommended by locals. My husband wanted to see every church and museum while I was happy just walking through markets and watching people. One afternoon, we stopped at a vineyard for a tour and tasting. The owner showed us rows of grapes growing on hillsides and explained how they made wine the same way their family had for generations. We sat on a stone wall overlooking the valley drinking wine straight from the barrel. My husband asked about my 5-year plan for work and whether I wanted to go for vice president eventually. I told him maybe, but I wasn't in a rush anymore. That climbing the ladder felt less important than building a life I actually enjoyed. He squeezed my hand and said he felt the same way about his career. We talked about maybe buying a house with a yard big enough for a garden, about traveling more instead of working 60-hour weeks, about possibly having kids in a few years if we both felt ready. The conversation felt easy and natural without pressure or expectations. Just two people figuring out their future together based on what they actually wanted instead of what they thought they should want. On our last day in Italy, we drove to a small town built into a hillside. We parked at the bottom and walked up narrow streets past shops selling pottery and leather goods. At the top was a church with a courtyard overlooking the countryside for miles. I stood at the stone wall looking out at vineyards and olive groves and red-roofed houses scattered across the valley. My husband went inside the church to look at the frescoes. I stayed outside alone with the view and the warm sun on my face. I thought about who I'd been 4 years ago when I almost married Robbie. That version of me had been so focused on checking boxes and meeting expectations, getting engaged, planning the perfect wedding, starting a family on schedule. I'd ignored every red flag because the timeline mattered more than the actual person I was marrying. Now I was standing in Italy on my actual honeymoon with someone who respected my boundaries and supported my choices. I had a career I'd built through my own work, not because someone handed it to me. Friends who showed up when things got hard instead of disappearing. A therapist who helped me process trauma instead of just pushing me to forgive and move on. I wasn't the daughter who got betrayed anymore. I was a regional manager who earned her position. A friend who people trusted and valued. A wife building a partnership based on honesty instead of obligation. Those identities felt more real and more important than being my mother's daughter ever had. My husband came out of the church and wrapped his arms around me from behind. We stood there watching the sun move across the valley without saying anything. We flew home 2 days later and I slept most of the flight, exhausted but content. My husband drove us from the airport to our townhouse and helped me carry our suitcases inside. Both cats ran to greet us, meowing loudly about being abandoned for 10 days. I fed them while my husband sorted through the mail that had piled up on the front table. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my aunt's handwriting on the front. Inside was a card with a watercolor painting of flowers on the front. My aunt had written a short note saying how beautiful the wedding was, and how proud my grandmother would have been to see the woman I'd become. She'd included 3 photos from the reception. One of me and my husband during our first dance. One of me laughing with Claire during the maid of honor speech. One of the whole wedding party gathered around our table. I looked at the photos for a long time, seeing genuine happiness on my face instead of the forced smile I'd worn in photos with Robbie. My husband came up behind me and looked over my shoulder at the pictures. He kissed the top of my head and said we should frame them. I agreed, and we spent the next hour hanging photos throughout our townhouse. The wedding pictures went in the living room where we'd see them every day. Photos from Italy went in the hallway. Pictures of our cats went in the bedroom. We were creating a home that reflected our actual life instead of some fantasy version we thought we should have. 6 months into married life, I woke up on a Saturday morning and realized I felt genuinely happy in a way I never had with Robbie. My husband was making coffee in the kitchen, and I could hear him talking to the cats about their breakfast demands. I walked out in my pajamas and he handed me a mug without me having to ask. We sat at our kitchen table reading the news on our phones and making plans for the day. Nothing dramatic or exciting, just grocery shopping and cleaning the house and maybe watching a movie that night. But it felt right in a way my old life never had. I'd built something real based on respect and honesty instead of competition and manipulation. My mother's betrayal would always be part of my story. I couldn't erase what happened or pretend it didn't shape who I became. But it wasn't the defining chapter anymore. This life I'd created with people who actually valued me, this was what mattered now. Well, that was totally normal and not emotionally scarring at all. Perfectly fine. Anyway, hit subscribe so we can do this again for some reason.